In our last exciting episode, we talked about first century paganism as the general milieu in the Greco-Roman world, the religious milieu in the Greco-Roman world. And remember that the pagan religions, I should continue. Remember that the pagan religions are polytheist. They are very tolerant because there are so many gods. No one god is not higher or better than another god. They were mostly concerned with cultic acts. They're not mostly concerned with how you live your life. In fact, the gods didn't really care. Thank you. How you lived your life. That was the how you live your life is the province of philosophers, not priests. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
The cultic act.
Sacrificial acts and prayers. Our cultic acts are
Good morning.
Good morning, Robert. Our cultic acts are singing, praying, communion, kneeling. Cultic acts are acts that you do in worship, and so
Ritualistic.
Pardon me. Ritualistic, right. And we have cultic acts. We do cultic acts. But remember that the focus of pagan religion was on those cultic acts. Our focus is on what we do with our lives the other 6 days of the week, or at least our focus is supposed to be on what we do with our lives the other 6 days of the week. And we use the cultus as the place to remind ourselves and recharge ourselves and reorient ourselves from the last week so that we could do the next week better than we did the last week. I mean, that's kind of what we do. That's how we see, because we see the desire of God having to do mostly with how we live our lives, not mostly with the cultic acts. That's one of the big differences between paganism and Judaism. Uh-oh. That just happened when your phone did something, Robert.
Did not.
Nuh-uh. And also paganism is mostly concerned with life in the present. Yes. Mostly concerned with life in the present. We look forward to an afterlife. And we look forward to an eternity. There's really no evidence that anybody in the first century thought there was an afterlife. Pagans or Jews thought there was an afterlife. So we look for a life in eternity, and they looked mostly for the benefits of ritual being derived in the present. Now we're going to talk about Judaism, first century Judaism. And of course Judaism is a religion, and it does have to do with a god or the gods, but there are clearly some differences. So how is Judaism like paganism? Well, first of all, the Jews did believe in a divine realm. Now, this is first century Judaism we're talking about. They did believe in a divine realm. Many of the early Jews, that is early in the Christian era, many of the early Jews believed in more than one God. But remember that the Ten Commandments say, "You shall have no other God before me." In other words, whatever else you do, you have to understand that I am the chief God. That was God's message to Israel, that I am the one who brought you out of Egypt, not somebody else. I am the one. I am the Lord. Remember when God was giving all these instructions to Moses, about every other sentence was, "I am the Lord. Remember, you shall have no other gods before me." There was one divine God, but there were other beings, angels, seraphim, cherubim. These are all mentioned in the scriptures. But there is only one divine God that is to be worshipped and served. They also, like the pagans, had places of special places of worship and prayer. They had cultic sacrifices, and they had prayers, like the pagans did. And most adherents focused on the here and now. As I said, maybe some first century Jews believed in an afterlife, but there's no evidence that was the broad belief among first century Jews. There are obviously some very significant distinctions. First of all, Judaism was monotheistic. While there are other celestial beings, there is only one divine God, only one God who created the universe and who was responsible for Israel's successes in the world. Israel being brought out of Egypt, Israel being delivered from the captivity in Babylonia, and those kinds of things. Only one God who created the universe. Now, this God was called the God of Judah. Judah is the place in the southern part of Israel that's called Judah, or we would say Judea. This God started off as the God of Judah in ancient times. When Abraham got to Judah, the God that Abraham worshipped was called the God of Judah. And all of Abraham's descendants worshipped the God of Judah. That's why they were called Jews, because they worshipped the God of Judah. So you rock along then for another 2,000 years or so between Abraham and Jesus, and the theology expands. This is not just the God of Judah, because you see the common thing was to believe in a God of this place and a God of that place, a God of this place and a God of that place. The God of Judah, the theology expanded over the millennia, that the God of Judah was the universal God. Oh my gosh, we have now found out that God didn't create just the Jews, didn't call just Abraham, but indeed created the entire universe. Of course, this bumps up against the chosen people nature of the Jews, doesn't it? It bumps up against that, since God called all human beings into existence. God clearly is the God of all human beings. Now what are we going to do? And here comes Jesus stumbling along and says, well, I'll tell you what you're going to do. And moves on from there, okay? We'll more about that ahead. Like I said, there's early evidence of polytheistic beliefs, but by Jesus' days, Jews were strict monotheists. The God of Judah was also the God of everywhere. God was so holy that even God's name could not be pronounced. You've seen this before. Even God's name could not be pronounced. And so when writing came into being, they created this tetragrammaton that in Hebrew looks like this, which they do not pronounce. Now, you've heard the word Jehovah or Yahweh. This cannot. The reason for the word Jehovah or Yahweh is that you can't pronounce this word without some kind of pointing, and the pointing that they did was to pronounce the word Adonai, Lord. So when a Jew, even today, when a Jew sees this, the Jew says Lord. This is God's name, which cannot be pronounced, but they say Lord when they see this. A little bit of seminary lore there. Okay, more distinctions. God had made a covenant with the ancestors of the Jews. This is another difference between Judaism and the polytheistic religions. The covenant with the Jewish people and God was made with the first Jew, the father of the Jews, who was, of course, Abraham. Yes, sir?
The cots have arrived for family promise, so if I've got a couple of able-bodied people, we can unload them in about 3 minutes.
Okay. And you're going to bring them through here?
No.
Is that what you're saying?
We're going to keep them over in the lower building, so we won't be interrupting it.
Okay, good. Okay, then another distinction was that the Jews believed that there had been this agreement between God, the one God, and the Jewish people. Now, the polytheists didn't have any kind of traffic with the divine realm like that. And so, but this was a God who actually spoke to people, had spoken to Abraham, and had made this covenant with Abraham. And the covenant said that God would be with the people, God would protect the people, and the people would worship only this God. That was the covenant. The covenant was confirmed under the leadership of Moses, and under the leadership of Moses, it was written down. Remember the tablets and all that kind of stuff. Here's a picture of Moses with the tablets. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, darn it. It was Charlton Heston holding 2 great big iPads. Moses and the tablets. Oh, gosh. Okay. Covenant. Yada, 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 yada. Okay. The third distinction was that the people had this thing called the law. Now, that's part of what Moses wrote down. The covenant included instructions from God on how the people were to live and how the people were to rightly worship God. The law was not this. A lot of people, especially Christians, a lot of people think that the law is this long list of undoable do's and don'ts that you're incapable, that you have to keep in order to attain salvation, but it's impossible to keep it, and so, oh my gosh. Well, the Jews never looked at it that way. The Jews never thought that it was a long list, undoable list of do's and don'ts. The Jews saw the law as God's greatest gifts. Remember that it would tell the people what right worship and right communal life would look like. That's what the law was. It was a set of teachings. The word Torah, which we usually interpret law, kind of woodenly I would say, the word Torah literally means instruction or guidance. A Torot is something that is a piece of information that I give to Robert so that he knows which key on my key ring opens my office. That's what a Torot is. And then Robert writes it down on a tablet and presents it to the people Israel, and off we go. Yay, Robert.
And the rest is history.
The law. Okay, here's a slight distinction I'm going to draw. The law is not an undoable list of do's and don'ts. The law is the covenantal obligation of the Jewish people. This is what you do because you are in this relationship with God. Because I am in a relationship with Beth McGill, I don't date other women. It's not that I am forced, handcuffed into not dating other women. I don't do it because that's the nature of the relationship I have with my wife. You understand what I'm talking about? So that the law was something that Jews kept gladly in order to express their thanksgiving for the salvation they had already received. The salvation that was already theirs by virtue of the fact that they were part of the chosen people and were promised by God to be God's holy and sacred possession. Do you see the distinction between I've got to do this because I'm a Jew, I can't eat ham, they don't, that's not the way the Jews look at it. They look at it as God's greatest gift to the people. The law is found in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, which is the Hebrew word for law or instruction, and Torah is a plural word. Torot is the singular, or the Pentateuch. Pentateuch, the Greek word for 5 scrolls. There we go. It was written down on the tablets by Moses. Isn't that great?
iPad tablets.
All right. I've already talked about what I want to say about the law. God's direction how worship live together. Faithful community law was not required. The law was not required for salvation. Keeping the law was not required for salvation.
And that's because they already knew that they were saved.
They were already saved because they were part of God's chosen people. God had said so.
Yeah.
A little like the nature of human beings is to be good. That's the nature of human beings. Why? Because God said so. When God finished the 6th day of creation and had created the human beings, God looked at everything that God had made and said, behold, it is very good. And so we were pronounced good for all time. The problem with sin, one of the problems with sin, is that it denies our nature. It denies who we were created, who and what we were created to be. All right. Following the law was faithful response to the salvation. You said that. It covered not only community standards, but also things that made Jews distinct from everybody else. Things like kosher laws. And these were designed to keep Jews distinct. There is a utilitarian part to this. If you eat pork that is not properly prepared, you get sick. And so kosher has in a way that you don't get sick with other kinds of meat. The males of the Jewish people had to be circumcised as a sign that they were part of the Jewish community. And you could, if you went to the bathhouse, you could tell who was a Jew and who was not. But it was not required for salvation. They prohibited usury, which, move forward to the 20th century, you might say, what happened? More Jewish distinctions. They also had specific places of worship. But their specific places of worship were not dedicated to this God and that God. Their specific places of worship were dedicated only to the one God. There were 2 kinds of places of worship. One was the temple in Jerusalem. The temple in Jerusalem was the only place where sacrifice could be made. This was a huge building. Somebody said it would hold 25 American football fields. This is a huge building. Parts of it were overlaid in gold. They had apartments set aside for the priests and all that kind of stuff. Were just amazing. It was the only place, according to the law, the only place that sacrifice was to be made. Now, there were other places of worship. Oh, I'm sorry. The temple was also a place of pilgrimage because there was only one of them. It was also a place of pilgrimage for the Jews, especially during feasts. And but most people couldn't go there. They were poor. They couldn't go, and they lived in a Roman province, and in Jesus' day, and before Jesus' day, poor by the taxes and all that kind of stuff, and so they might not be able to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So there developed these things called synagogue. Synagogue, which means it's a Greek word which means gathered together. The synagogues were a place where people could say their prayers, they could read and study Torah, they could hear preaching on the law and the prophets, but there was no sacrifice made in the synagogues. This is the synagogue in Jerusalem. This is the synagogue. These are bad pictures for this kind of a screen. This I have been here. One thing you notice about these steps, they are irregular. They are irregular in height, and they are irregular in tread. Some of the treads are this deep. Some of the treads are this deep. Some of the steps are this high. Some of the steps are this high. They are irregular, and there is no pattern. It fascinated me. There is no pattern. Why? Why in such an opulent place where things were measured down to the gnat's ass, why in the world would this main entrance to the doors to the temple were here? Why would this main entrance have irregular steps?
They hired a lousy stonemason.
They hired a lousy stonemason.
They used it as a military defense.
Because life wasn't the same. Life was hard, and there were different steps that led you to there.
Okay. It probably also had some utility as a military defense. They were made irregular so that you had to pay attention to what you were doing as you were going to worship. You could not be thinking about or whether you had shown up yesterday to cook the ribs with the Brotherhood of St. Andrew. You could not think about whether your wife had remembered to go to the grocery store or anything else. You had to pay attention to what you were doing and focus your life on what you were about to enter upon. And that was the stated reason for which these steps were like that. By the way, speaking of military defense, if you've ever been to to Bethlehem and seen the Church of the Holy Nativity, the Church of the Holy Nativity has a door that's about this wide and about this high, and you have to duck under it in order to go in it.
It's the door in a door.
Well, actually, it is a door in a door, because they had made this humongous door at one point, and it was easily entered with a chariot and horses and spears and knives and swords and grenades and machine guns. So what they did was they made that smaller. Well, it was still, you could still get in it under full armor with machine guns, knives and swords and grenades. And so they made it smaller. I think there's only three. I think there's only three. There may have been another. Anyway, so the door these days is this wide and this high. Some people say, well, it's to humble yourself before the birthplace of Jesus. That's not why it was built that way. It was built that way to keep out the marauding hordes. Okay, so isn't that interesting that you have to pay attention to what you're doing when you're going into the synagogue? This is a synagogue in New York City. It really is prettier than this picture says. It's a lot nicer on the.
Hired a better photographer.
Should have, one that took better resolution, pictures of better resolution. Okay. Now, it would be a mistake to think that ancient Judaism was this monolithic thing and all the Jews were just alike, and that's not true. As a matter of fact, there were as great a diversity in first century Judaism as there is in 20th century, 21st century Christianity in the West. We've got Lutherans and Methodists and snake-handling Baptists and Episcopalians. Okay. There was some diversity in Judaism. We're going to talk about 4 distinct groups within Judaism. The first distinct group is the Pharisees. Now, we hear a lot about Pharisees, and generally speaking, Westerners like us grew up thinking that a Pharisee was a hypocrite. Now, calling a Pharisee a hypocrite would be the same thing as calling Baptists a fornicator or an Episcopalian a drunkard. I'm sure there are Episcopalians who are drunkards, and I'm sure there are Baptists who are fornicators. But to classify, to define Episcopalianism as drunkards would be like saying the Pharisees were hypocrites. And in specific, our Lord Jesus Christ took great pleasure in pointing out the parts of Pharisaism that seemed to him hypocritical. But that was not their point. Their point was not to put on a good face any more than your point is to put on a good face. The point of Phariseeism was not to put on a good face any more than your desire is to put on a good face. The Pharisees were, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the fourth philosophy. Those are the four that we're going to talk about. Pharisees, not hypocrites. They were separated from the rest. They separated themselves from the rest of the Jews by their eminent piety. Their desire was to keep the law as much as they possibly could. They were desperate to keep the law. Remember, Jesus, one of the things that Jesus said was, you tithe mint and cumin, but you won't lift a finger to help the poor. Because the law has to do with tithing and all that kind of stuff, and so, but you won't lift a finger to help these people who are struggling. The law didn't call for that. So, and that was what that's what Jesus' problem was. The Pharisees, in their desire to keep the oral law, to keep the law of Moses, developed what they called the oral law. You see, the law is not very self-explanatory. For example, the law says you don't work on the Sabbath. That's all it says. So, what does that mean? What constitutes work? Well, you don't work on the Sabbath, so if you're a farmer, you don't go out and harvest your field on the Sabbath. Okay, we got that. Okay, what does it mean to harvest? What if you're hungry and you just go out and pluck some fruit to eat to feed yourself? Is that work? Well, in a way, it's like work. You're doing something. But it's not really like harvesting, is it? So what about if you walk through your field and you bump up against the fig tree and some figs fall to the ground? Is that work? Are you harvesting? Is that work? All these things have to be determined. And in their desire to keep the law, they had to come up with explanations of the law. And so they developed this oral law. The oral law was sort of the interpolation of the law of Moses. The law of Moses says honor your father and your mother. Well, what does that mean? And because the law doesn't go on to say honor your father and mother by doing this and this and this and make sure that the nursing home you put them in has been approved by the government. The law doesn't say that. It says honor your father and mother. That's all it says. So the oral law was developed in order that the Pharisees might have a better way to keep the law and kind of be separate by their eminent piety. That's what they wanted to. They were desperate to be faithful. We can see, though, that in desperation to be faithful, we can run amok. We can run afoul of the very thing we're trying to do. The oral law was to interpret the written law and was written into a collection, eventually, was written into a collection of the oral law called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is part of the Talmud. Part of the Talmud, yes.
Are the Hasidic Jews are Pharisees? descendants or something, maybe? Or
That may be. Hasidic Jews are those who you see pictures sometimes, or if you live in New York, you see them. The ones that have the ringlets on the side and always have their heads covered and always wear a black suit and that kind of thing, even when they play baseball, or stickball in the street.
They're almost like a political party. They are subsidized work.
That sounds like the ultra-Orthodox.
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay? Now the Sadducees. We're going to talk about the Sadducees now. The Sadducees did not subscribe to the oral law. You would think that the Pharisees, being the sort of vestry of Judaism, would say, okay, this is the way things are going to be. But the Sadducees did not subscribe to the oral law. The Sadducees, as we have found out, first of all, they left no. They didn't wrote the oral. These left no writings. They tended to be some contemporaneous writings have shown that the Sadducees tended to be made up of the Jewish aristocracy, the rich people. And because they were part of the aristocracy, the Sadducees made up the temple hierarchy. So all the chief priests and the scribes and all those kinds of folks, they were part of the Sadducees. Now you can see why in the stories that we have in the Gospels, the Sadducees came and asked this question, or the scribes and Pharisees. The Pharisees and the scribes were sometimes in two different parties. So when they say the Pharisees and the scribes came against Jesus, that was everybody. Everybody getting it from both sides. But the Sadducees were very often not just the temple hierarchy, but they were very often the liaison between the temple and the Roman government. The Sadducees were the rich folks. So sometimes, once or twice, there is a mention in the Gospels, where Jesus heals Jairus' daughter. Jairus was a Roman governor or centurion or something. He was a Roman, but the people came to Jesus and said, he deserves to be helped because he helped us build our synagogue. You remember that? We don't read. I don't think we read that story in the 3-year lectionary for some reason. Anyway, they say he deserves your help because he helped to build our synagogue. So there was commerce, there was communication between the Romans and the hierarchy of the temple, and so that was the Sadducees. Now the Pharisees stressed keeping the law. The Sadducees stressed temple sacrifice. You can understand why. You came in, you say, I have a goat here to sacrifice. They say, okay, that'll be 3 shekels. And you pay your 3 shekels. They lead the goat in, and the high priest sacrifices the goat for you. And says prayers and all that kind of stuff. So this is how they made their living. Sort of like my daughter wants to get married. Can you do the ceremony? And some people, certainly not me, some people said, sure, it'll be $250, please. Certainly not me. All right. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
You would do that cheaply.
Yeah, you're going to charge them $500.
Yeah, certainly not me. I wouldn't do it for $250. Are you kidding me?
Flavius Josephus differentiates them primarily in that the Sadducees were more secular in their theological approach than the Pharisees.
Correct. Josephus made that distinction that they were interested in how you get along in this life, and that's why they.
The way the Romans did.
Right. Okay, the Essenes. This is the third group. The Essenes are never mentioned in the New Testament, but we have a lot of information, interestingly, about the Essenes. The Essenes were a a group that thought that God calls for a certain amount of purity. It's warm in here. Thank you, Jim. That God calls us to a certain level of purity. And according to the Essenes, the people had fallen away from that greatly, had fallen away from the from purity. And so they formed some monastic communities within which the Essenes would dedicate themselves to purity. Including ritual purity. Essenes bathed very regularly. Most people back in those days bathed once a week, maybe. Essenes bathed almost daily, and every week the Essenes went through the mikvah. The mikvah is not only a thing. I mean, it is a thing. It's a tub. Yeah, it's a tub. It's about 4 feet square and about 4 feet deep. And someplace in the law it says that a faithful Jew has to be completely submerged underwater once a week. And so they would do the mikvah once a week. They lived apart in monastic communities. They emphasized personal and spiritual purity, personal with physical purity, and spiritual because they studied the scriptures devotedly and deeply. The community at Qumran was a community of Essenes, and there was at Qumran at one point a man named John. It is thought that John the Baptist was probably, before he went to the north to baptize in the Jordan River, he was an Essene. This is why he baptized in the river. This is why he dunked people under the water. That's where he kind of got his idea. But John the Baptist was separated from the Essene community because he began to understand that what God called for was not circumcision of the body, but circumcision of the heart. In other words, you had to have your heart right in order to be with God, not just your body clipped off in a certain way. That was not as important to John as the purity of heart and spirit, which is what John was baptizing for. John baptized for what?
Salvation?
No. Repentance.
For repentance. For repentance and the forgiveness of sin. That's a purity in John that John went after. An Essene community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. At Qumran, they produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in 1947. 1947. That's like yesterday in terms of biblical study, certainly New Testament study. Qumran is up here. This is the Dead Sea. This is En Gedi, where David went out into the wilderness when he was fleeing from Saul. Remember that? This is the En Gedi wilderness. There's Jerusalem and Bethlehem there. It's the Dead Sea, Jordan River. The Dead Sea is 33% salt and other minerals. Yes, Jim?
Just as a spoiler alert, Paul talks about the struggle between the spirit and the body, and the Essenes seem to have that woven into their philosophy.
Right. It's a great study. It's a great struggle, and that's why they had these communities, separated communities. Yes, ma'am.
Who is the Sanhedrin? Would it be the Sadducees?
The Sanhedrin was comprised of Pharisees and Sadducees, almost entirely. Okay, here's the visitor center at Qumran. This was built by the Essenes back in the 5th century BC. Come on. It was a joke there. You know. There's Qumran. This is where the ruins are that you can. The Dead Sea is here. That you can visit the ruins today, and you can see the mikvahs and all that kind of stuff. The caves. This is a wadi right here. This is a valley. The caves were found in this ridge right here. That's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. You can see them, and when you're in Qumran, you can look across that valley and see the caves. Side of the where the books were found, the scrolls were found. Oh, this is the great Isaiah scroll.
Interesting, the left corner of that almost looks like a cross.
I beg your pardon?
Go back. Look at the lower left.
Yeah, the whole.
Oh, the hole. Yeah. Well, it looks like certainly looks like a Celtic cross. All right. The fourth philosophy. This was not an organized group. This was a group of people, and they didn't even have a name. Their emphasis was on the land. So the Pharisees emphasized piety by keeping the law. The Sadducees emphasized temple sacrifice. The Essenes emphasized spiritual and ritual purity. The fourth philosophy emphasized the land and its importance to Israel. They believed that the land was given by God to Abraham, and nobody was allowed to come in and govern or try to take over their land. No one could take their land away. God said so. You can understand that these guys and gals, I imagine, these were the ones who were the zealots. These were the ones who were ready to go to war against the Romans in order to kick them out of the land that God had given to them and them alone. This is our land. This land is not your land. This land is my land. And you, if you are not part of the chosen people of God, don't belong here. Now, they believed that God had given them not just the land, but God had given them the authority to do violence for the land against any non-Jewish entity that would attempt to rule the land. You can imagine how this would end. Eventually, they had their way. The Jewish uprising of 70 CE was the one where the temple was destroyed. The second temple was destroyed. And they were by the Romans, but they had their day in court or on the battlefield, as it were.
Father Jim, when did the Jewish people go to Masada?
Masada was before Jesus. It was before Jesus. The Maccabean revolt was before Jesus was born, and they separated themselves in Masada. Masada is not far from Qumran. Masada is not far from Qumran. Yes, sir.
I think the question he's asking is when did they have the mass suicide of Masada, and that was during the 70s. That was during Vespasian's final taking of the temple.
Okay,
But Masada was there because Herod sent his family there when he was afraid of Caesar. So it had been there since the
right.
Yeah, he had built it.
Right.
The actual suicide at Masada that took place was 70 CE, right after the temple.
70 CE, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, because the Romans came and sacked Jerusalem, and then they took the slaves out to Masada and had the Jewish slaves build the ramps and things
Right.
up there.
Right.
And that's why the
Good
Jewish
point.
defenders couldn't kill them.
Right, because they were homeboys. Okay. Now, there is another perspective. By the way, the Zealots, the fourth philosophy, were populated. Not everybody was a member of one of these groups. Not everybody was either it wasn't like you had to be either a Pharisee or a Sadducee or an Essene or a member of the fourth philosophy. Lots of people were not. I mean, there's a lot of people around that live around here who aren't a member of any church. They call themselves Christians, they are Christians, but they're not a member of any church. They don't go to church on Sunday, and so they're not Episcopalians or Lutherans or Baptists or anything else. They're just out there, Christians. So, there was another perspective that was embraced by members of probably all of those groups that I have just described, and it was called Ancient Jewish Apocalypticism. Apocalyptists were a particular way of thinking about things. They weren't a group. I mean, here's the Pharisees and here's the apocalypticists. It didn't work like that. There were a lot of people who were members of other groups that embraced this philosophy of the apocalypticists. It was a widespread form of belief among the several groups, as I just said. And they had some characteristics. First is that they were dualistic in nature. They believed that everything and everybody was either good or bad, either embraced the forces of evil or embraced the forces of good. Now, you can understand right away, your mind is spinning, I know, because you can see that things like evil and death and sickness are bad. They're clearly bad. And health and prosperity, those are things that are good. What about a place where both of those things can exist at the same time? Like, I don't know, a human being. There's the problem, right? The human being has good parts and bad parts. Peter is a handsome man. That's good. He's a capable man. That's good. He makes great ribs. That's good. But once in a while, am I right?
No. Yes.
No. And that's bad. So the apocalypticists looked at everything as dualistic. This includes history itself. We now live in an evil time, in which sin and death and poverty and violence all exist. And this is an evil time. It is ruled by the forces of evil. But a time is coming when the forces of good are going to overcome the forces of evil. And God will usher in God's good kingdom. Not only that, but there will be some kind of cosmic thing that happens that will usher in this good time. Second, ancient Jewish apocalypticists were pessimists. They didn't think there was really much that you and I can do about changing the nature of the world we live in right now. Now, whether they were right or not is perhaps up to discussion, because there were apocalypticists who said, well, we live in an evil world, that's just the way it is, and so screw it, I'm going to go off and go fishing, But there were also ancient Jewish apocalypticists who said you should do everything you can do to make your part of the world in this evil age into as good a thing as it can possibly be. Troy should rule his household. I love saying things like that. Troy should rule his household with righteousness and justice and love for the well-being of his entire family. That's what he should do. In spite of the fact that where are we going and why are we in this handbasket? In spite of that, Troy should make sure his household is done well. But overall, we're not going to change probably the course of history. because it is God who will usher in that. God will usher in that time. It is God that will vindicate God's name and God's values in the world. Judgment day is coming, they said. This was their philosophy. Judgment day is coming when all people, living and dead, there will be a resurrection and everybody will be raised to stand judgment, which comes after resurrection. There will be a general resurrection. All the dead people will come back and they will be judged as good or evil. And you can't get out of that. Resurrection will see judgment by the living and the dead. In other words, according to this philosophy, this apocalypticist philosophy, you couldn't spend your whole life taking advantage of people and screwing other people and making a fortune and then die and get away with it. You couldn't do that. You couldn't die and get away with it. This assumes an afterlife, doesn't it? Yeah. You couldn't do that. So the resurrection comes, and then the judgment. And then God will establish God's good kingdom. And the fourth thing is, this is going to happen next Thursday. This was going to happen very, very soon. And very, very soon, because God had put up with all this crap for all these centuries and all this, the Noah thing, and God said, well, let's don't deal with it that way, By the way, if you think that God doesn't change, you haven't read the Bible. You realize that when God made the human being, according to one of the creation stories, God made a single human being. And that wasn't going to work because what? It was lonely. It was lonely. God didn't know from lonely. Why would God think this human was going to be lonely? But the human was lonely. And so what was God's first idea?
Animals. God created animals.
Animals. God said, you sit there on that rock, and God ran all the animals by to see which one of them was going to be the perfect mate for the human being. Now, isn't that a gas? Huh? From aardvark to zebra, they all went by, and guess what? There was not found an helpmate meet. Right? That's what the King James said. And helpmate meet for the man, for the human being. And so then what did God do? Then God performed this great divine surgery. Put the guy under anesthesia, split apart maleness from femaleness, which assumably was all contained in one beforehand. See, God doesn't understand lack of community. God is community. In God's very self, there is community. Before God made it, people say, well, God made humankind because God wanted somebody to hang out with. No. God hung out with God's self. That's how it worked. God doesn't know from loneliness. God's never been lonely. And so when the guy was lonely, when the human being was lonely, God's first idea was the animals. Well, that didn't work, and we even have laws about that now, don't we? Huh? So if you don't think God learns a lesson, and then comes Noah, and God said, well, we'll just flood the whole sumbitch. And then God said, well, that didn't work either. So we'll do the rainbow. And I saw a rainbow the other day. I think I said this in my sermon. I saw a rainbow the other day, and my first thought was, God sees that rainbow. Because that's what it says in the Bible. That's what it says in the Bible. Who's the rainbow for? The rainbow is for God, to remind God not to flood the world. And it's a bow, like a bow and arrow. It's a bow like this, and it's aimed up at God, one assumes. It's aimed up, and I will see it, and I will remember, don't do this again. So if you don't think God has a learning curve, you haven't read the Bible. Okay, so the great reversal would come very soon. As a matter of fact, a well-known first century ancient Jewish apocalypticist said, "I tell you this, some of you here will not taste death until all of this comes to pass." These, of course, are the words of Jesus, who was one of the best known of the ancient Jewish apocalypticists. As a matter of fact, he is in good company because another great Jewish apocalypticist was Paul, who said the same thing. There is urgency here because all this is going to happen next Thursday. So a little bit about Judaism. Next week, we're going to talk about some of the early traditions about Jesus, how the stories about Jesus spread, leading up to the time that the Gospels were actually written. And of course, this is of course about the Gospels. We're finally going to get to that in the fifth of our 9 or 10 lectures. We will finally get to the first of the Gospels. And we'll spend a day on each Gospel. We'll spend a class session on each Gospel. Next, though, we're going to talk about how the stories spread. Any questions?